The silence within the grand ossuary of the Cherubim Dominion was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a crushing pressure generated by 10,000 years of absolute authority and the gravitational dampeners that kept the colossal obsidian structure suspended above the homeworld's sprawling capital. In this chamber, where the air tasted of ozone and ancient, polished bone, the air of superiority was breathable, thick enough to choke those who did not possess the respiratory fortitude of the ruling caste. High Archon Vralik sat upon the throne of severed stars, his four-armed frame draped in ceremonial armor woven from the metallic fibers of conquered civilizations, his compound eyes reflecting the dim, bioluminescent glow of the strategic hologram hovering in the center of the room. He did not move, for movement suggested urgency, and urgency suggested fear, a concept that the Cherubim had supposedly evolved beyond 3 millennia ago when they first cracked the light-speed barrier and realized that the galaxy was a garden of prey waiting to be harvested. Around him, the Council of War stood in rigid formation, their chitinous shells gleaming under the cold lights, their mandibles clicking in a subsonic rhythm that conveyed deference and suppressed aggression. They were waiting for the final authorization, the simple gesture that would consign a new species to the annals of extinction, a footnote in the grand history of the Dominion. Vralik watched the hologram, which displayed a spinning, unassuming sector of space located on the frayed edge of the galactic spiral arm, a region of dust and negligible resources known as the Velorum Drift. In the center of the display pulsed a single, irritating red icon, representing a blockade runner or perhaps a colonization vessel, belonging to the species that called themselves Terrans. The High Archon found their name presumptuous, derived from the dirt of their homeworld, yet they walked with a swagger that suggested they owned the firmament. The report from the border patrols had been confusing, riddled with data anomalies that the science caste attributed to faulty sensors, but which Vralik suspected were the result of incompetence. The Terrans had occupied a localized nebula within the drift, a region the Dominion had marked for eventual resource extraction, though they had ignored it for centuries. When the Dominion's vanguard requested the Terrans to vacate, the response had not been a plea for mercy, nor a declaration of war. It had been a polite, automated request for the Dominion fleet to alter its course to avoid interrupting calibration protocols. The sheer audacity of it, a prey animal asking the predator to step aside so it could finish grazing, had sent a ripple of indignation through the high command that had culminated in this very meeting. "The Armada is assembled, High Archon," General Kraz said, his voice a grinding rasp that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of the ossuary. Kraz was a behemoth of a warrior, his carapace scarred from 100 campaigns, his belief in the supremacy of Cherubim firepower absolute. "The Eclipse of Reason, the Hammer of Void, and the entire 7th Subjugation Fleet are holding position at the jump point. We wait only for your command to purge the drift." The sensors indicate a single Terran vessel is maintaining position at the nebula's heart. It is small, unshielded by conventional metrics. It barely registers as a threat. It is an insult. Kraz stepped forward, his heavy footsteps ringing on the floor. "They do not respect the boundaries of the Dominion because they have never felt the weight of our displeasure. One volley from the Eclipse will vaporize their ship and the surrounding dust clouds. It will be a lesson written in plasma." Vralik shifted on the throne, the movement causing the heavy armor plates to grind against one another with a sound like tectonic plates shifting. He looked at the hologram, zooming in on the representation of the Terran ship. It was ugly. That was the only word for it. It lacked the sleek, predatory curves of Cherubim engineering, the aesthetic of speed and violence that defined the Dominion's fleet. Instead, the Terran vessel was a blocky utilitarian rectangle, a collection of girders, massive radiator fins, and exposed conduits that looked more like a floating refinery than a starship. It had no visible weapon ports, no glowing engine nacelles indicative of high-yield combat drives, and its hull was a dull, unpainted gray scuffed by micrometeoroids. It looked like debris. It looked like a mistake. And yet it sat there, immobile against the swirling violet gases of the nebula, ignoring the hails of a fleet that could glass a planet in an hour. "Is there any further communication from the entity?" Vralik asked, his voice a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the chests of the council members. He was not afraid, but he was cautious. The Cherubim had not survived for thousands of years by charging blindly into the unknown, even if the unknown looked pathetic. Have they responded to the demand for surrender? "They have, High Archon," said Sub-Overseer Lyra, the chief of diplomatic intelligence, stepping out from the shadows of the pillars. She was smaller, her shell intricate and painted with the sigils of logic and linguistics. She held a data slate in her lower hands, her upper hands twitching nervously. The transmission was received 3 standard cycles ago. It is repetitive. They claim to be the USC Hephaestus. They identify as a civil engineering and hazard mitigation vessel. They state that the region is currently under quarantine for geometric restructuring and that our presence is a safety violation. They have not threatened us. They have cited a municipal code. A low rumble of laughter moved through the council, a sound of clicking mandibles and hissing vents. The idea that a single ship facing the might of the 7th Fleet would cite a safety violation was so absurd it bordered on madness. Kraz slammed a fist into his palm. They mock us. They hide their fear behind bureaucracy. They think their delusion of authority will save them. Let us show them the only code that matters in this galaxy, the code of the Conqueror. Vralik raised a hand, silencing the room instantly. The silence returned, heavier than before. He stared at the ugly gray rectangle on the hologram. Something about the calmness of the message, the utter lack of desperation, gnawed at the back of his mind. Species that were about to be annihilated usually begged. They bargained. They screamed threats they couldn't back up. They did not file complaints about safety hazards. Civil engineering, Vralik mused, tasting the words. They act as if they are building a road and we are merely traffic. It implies a perspective of scale that I find distasteful, but Kraz is right. We cannot allow a single ship to stall the expansion of the Dominion. If they will not move for the threat of death, let them be moved by death itself. Kraz, initiate the jump. Burn the vessel, secure the nebula, and bring me the debris. I wish to see what kind of minds produce such arrogance. The order was given. The hologram shifted to red, the color of war. In the void of space, light years away, the fabric of reality tore open as the Cherubim Armada engaged its drives, slipping through the subspace tunnels to emerge in the Velorum drift. The transition was violent, a tearing of the cosmic curtain that announced their arrival with a burst of Cherenkov radiation that would have blinded any organic eye watching from a nearby asteroid. The fleet emerged in a perfect formation, a wall of jagged, spiked hulls that blocked out the distant starlight. Hundreds of warships, ranging from fast attack corvettes to the gargantuan dreadnought Eclipse of Reason, filled the vacuum with their mass. Their engines burned with the blue-white fire of fusion, and their weapon capacitors charged with a hum that could be felt through the hull plates. At the center of the nebula, the USC Hephaestus hung motionless. It did not power up shields. It did not maneuver. It did not launch fighters. It simply drifted, its navigational lights blinking in a slow, rhythmic pulse that seemed almost lazy. On the bridge of the Eclipse, Fleet Admiral Torgath stood on the command dais, looking out at the tiny gray speck on the main view screen. The nebula swirled around it, a bruise-colored fog of ionized gas and dust. "Target locked," the weapons officer reported, his voice tight with the anticipation of bloodshed. "The enemy vessel is scanning us, Admiral. Active ping, low intensity. It feels invasive." "Let them scan," Torgath sneered. "Let them see the architecture of their doom. Open a channel, one last chance to kneel." The screen flickered, and the audio channel opened. There was no static, no interference, just a crystal-clear voice that sounded like a synthetic recreation of a calm, middle-aged male. "Attention, unidentified fleet. This is the USC Hephaestus. You have entered a designated hard hat zone during active stabilization protocols. Your mass shadows are destabilizing the local metric. Please withdraw to a distance of 3 astronomical units immediately. Failure to comply may result in structural damage to your vessels due to environmental hazards. This is an automated safety warning. Please acknowledge." Torgath stared at the screen, his mandibles quivering with rage. "They call us a safety hazard. We are the Cherubim. We are the storm that scours the galaxy." He slammed his claw onto the firing console. "All ships fire at will. Vaporize that insult." The order was transmitted at the speed of light. Hundreds of weapon ports on the Armada opened. Torpedoes, plasma beams, and kinetic railgun slugs were unleashed in a torrent of destruction that could have cracked a moon in half. The space between the fleet and the lone human. Ship filled with death, a blinding cascade of energy and metal hurtling toward the Hephaestus. The crew of the Eclipse watched, expecting the sudden flash of a reactor breach, the scattering of debris, the end of the annoyance. But the flash never came. As the bombardment approached the human ship, the space around the Hephaestus seemed to ripple. It was not a shield, not in the sense of an energy barrier that absorbed impact. It was a distortion, like looking at a stone at the bottom of a rushing stream. The plasma beams, straight lines of coherent light, suddenly bent, curving smoothly around the hull of the human ship as if sliding off a greased surface. The kinetic slugs, traveling at a fraction of the speed of light, did not impact. They diverted, their trajectories rewritten by an invisible hand, spiraling harmlessly into the depths of the nebula behind the ship. The torpedoes, confused by the sudden warping of spacetime, detonated prematurely, their fireballs contained and compressed into tiny, harmless spheres of glowing gas that dissipated in seconds. Silence fell over the bridge of the Eclipse. The weapons officer checked his console, tapping it frantically. "Malfunction? Did we miss?" "Impossible," Torgeth growled. "We filled the grid with fire. Nothing misses at this range. Fire again, full spread, overload the capacitors." The second volley was even more intense than the first. The cherubim poured every ounce of their wrath into the void, and again the universe seemed to disagree with their violence. This time the effect was more visible. A visible sphere of distortion appeared around the Hephaestus, a lens of gravity so potent it bent the light of the background stars into a halo. The attacks were swallowed by the distortion and spat out at odd angles, vectoring away into the empty dark. The human ship remained untouched, its paint still dull, its navigation lights still blinking that slow, rhythmic pulse. Then the radio crackled again. The voice was the same, calm, unbothered, perhaps slightly more insistent. "Attention! We detect high-energy discharges from your location. Please be advised that kinetic aggression within the stabilization zone is strictly prohibited. You are disrupting the harmonic resonance of the local cluster. If you continue to emit hostile energy, we will be forced to implement dampening protocols to ensure the safety of the project. Please withdraw. This is your second warning." Torgeth felt a cold dread seeping into his blood, a sensation he had never experienced in his 100 years of service. This was not a battle. A battle implied an exchange. This was a rejection of their ability to inflict harm. "What are they?" he whispered. "Scan them again, deep spectrum." "Admiral," the sensor officer's voice trembled. "I am reading gravity waves, massive ones, but they aren't coming from a drive plume. They are coming from the hull itself, the ship. It has the gravitational footprint of a neutron star, but localized to a few hundred meters. It's manipulating the curvature of spacetime with pinpoint accuracy. They aren't shielding against the shots. They are telling the universe that the shots simply cannot exist in that space." "Gravity manipulation," Torgeth hissed. "That is theoretical physics. No reactor can power that. They are hailing us again, Admiral. Not a recording this time, live feed." The main screen shifted. The image of the nebula vanished, replaced by the interior of the human ship. It was shockingly mundane. There were no grand trophies, no dark lighting, no warrior-cast guards. It was a bright, clean room, filled with holographic displays of mathematical formulas and topographical maps of space. Standing in the center was a human. He was small, soft-skinned, wearing a simple orange jumpsuit with grease stains on the pockets. He held a mug of steaming liquid in one hand and looked tired. He did not look like a warrior. He looked like an overworked technician who had been interrupted during a lunch break. "This is Chief Engineer Aris Thorne of the USC Hephaestus," the human said, rubbing his eyes. "Look, guys, I don't know who you are, but you're really messing up my readings. I'm trying to calibrate a gravimetric shear to stabilize this nebula before it collapses into a protostar and irradiates this whole sector. You're throwing a lot of noise at me. I'm asking you politely, please move your fleet. You are standing in the middle of a construction site." Torgeth stared at the human. The indignity was unbearable. "You speak to the Cherubim Dominion?" Torgeth bellowed, his voice amplified over the channel. "We are the masters of this sector. You will lower your defenses and surrender your technology, or we will ram your vessel and crush you beneath our hull." The human, Thorne, sighed. It was a deep, weary sigh. He took a sip from his mug. "Right, Dominion, look, I don't care about your politics. I'm a contractor, but I can't let you ram me. That would damage the equipment, and I really can't let you stay here. The shear is scheduled to activate in 4 minutes. If you're here when it happens, well, physics doesn't care about your empire." "We do not retreat," Torgeth screamed. "All ships, ramming speed, crush them." The transmission cut. Thorne shook his head on the black screen before it faded. On the bridge, the cherubim roared their war cries. The engines of the Eclipse and the surrounding battleships flared to maximum output. They surged forward, a tidal wave of millions of tons of composite armor and anger, intent on physically obliterating the tiny speck that defied them. On the Hephaestus, Aris Thorne set his mug down on the console. He looked at his co-pilot, a woman named Alara, who was calmly typing commands into a fluid interface. "They aren't stopping," she said quietly. "Nope," Aris replied. Stubborn, all right. Initiate the dampening protocol, localized inversion, keep the hull integrity at 100%. I don't want to scratch the paint. And spin up the grav well. Let's put them in timeout. Authorization. Authorization code, Newton's apple. Execute. As the Cherubim fleet closed the distance, now only a few thousand kilometers away, the Hephaestus did something that defied the comprehension of the alien onlookers. The ship did not move, but the space around it suddenly expanded. It was a terrifying optical illusion made real. The distance between the Armada and the human ship, which they were crossing at high velocity, suddenly stretched. They were moving at full speed, but the Hephaestus seemed to be receding faster than they could catch it. The fabric of space was being generated between them, an infinite corridor of distance created in real time. Then, the Hephaestus pulsed. A wave of distortion, invisible but felt by every crew member as a sudden lurch in their stomachs, radiated outward. It washed over the Armada. On the Eclipse, the alarms screamed. Inertial dampeners failing, the helm officer shrieked. Velocity is 0, no, velocity is negative, we are being pulled. Pulled by what? Torgath demanded, gripping the rail of his dais. By everything, the ships, we are pulling each other. Aris Thorn had inverted the gravitational interaction of the enemy fleet. Instead of their mass being neutral to one another, he had effectively turned every ship in the Cherubim Armada into a localized gravity well, while simultaneously neutralizing their engine thrust relative to the universal constant. The result was instantaneous chaos. The corvettes, lighter and faster, were suddenly jerked violently toward the massive battleships, drawn in by their immense mass. The formation collapsed. Ships collided not out of pilot error, but because physics demanded they touch. But it was not a violent, fiery crash. As the ships touched, the kinetic energy was leached away by the field the Hephaestus was projecting. They didn't explode, they crunched. They folded, they merged. The Eclipse of Reason, the pride of the fleet, found itself the center of a terrifying accretion disk made of its own escort ships. Metal groaned and shrieked as hulls were pressed together by irresistible magnetic and gravitational forces. The Armada was being balled up, literally compressed into a sphere of scrap metal. Torgath watched in horror as the prow of a cruiser drifted helplessly into the bridge window of his dreadnought, pressing against the transparasteel with a slow, grinding screech. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the red glow of emergency power. The engines whined and then cut out, suffocated by the field. The mighty 7th Fleet, the hammer of the Dominion, had been reduced to a floating junkyard, a ball of debris drifting aimlessly in the void. And through it all, the Hephaestus remained untouched, hovering just outside the chaos. The comms channel crackled to life again. Thorn's voice was apologetic. Okay, so that's the dampening protocol. I've neutralized your kinetic potential and bound your relative mass. You're basically stuck together until I release the field. Nobody is dead, I hope. I tried to keep the compression slow enough to avoid hull breaches. Torgath slumped to the floor of the tilted bridge. His world was shattered. The philosophy of the Cherubim that the strong devour the weak had been dismantled. They were not the strong. They were children throwing stones at a mountain. What are you? Torgath whispered into the comms unit. You are not engineers. This is the power of gods. Gods? Thorn's voice sounded amused. Nah, just physics. We learned a long time ago that fighting against the universe is hard. It's much easier to just ask the universe to do the fighting for you. Now look, I'm going to tow your ball out of the immediate danger zone. The nebula is going to flare in about 10 minutes. Sit tight. Once we're clear, I'll reverse the polarity and you can unstick yourselves. But you have to promise to leave. I have a deadline. The humiliation was total. The Hephaestus extended a tractor beam, not a beam of light, but a focused tunnel of gravity, and latched onto the massive sphere of fused alien warships. The tiny, ugly tugboat began to pull the wreckage of the greatest armada in the sector away from the nebula. Back in the Grand Ossuary, High Archon Vralik and his council watched the feed die. The hologram went dark. The room was silent for a long time. The arrogance that had filled the chamber an hour ago had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow fear. They had sent a fleet to crush an insect, and the insect had simply put them in a box and moved them out of the way. They spared them, Sub-Overseer Lyra whispered, breaking the silence. They could have crushed the fleet into a singularity, a black hole. They had the power, but they just stuck them together like unruly children. Vralik looked at his hands. They were trembling. They did not fight us, he said, his voice quiet. They managed us. We were an inconvenience, not an enemy. He looked up at the council, his eyes wide. What happens when they decide we are a threat? What happens when the gardener decides the weeds must be pulled? We must contact them, Vralik said, standing up. The armor felt heavy now, burdensome. Not to demand surrender, but to apologize. If they can manipulate gravity like that for civil engineering, imagine what their warships can do. The realization hung in the air. If the Hephaestus was a civilian construction vehicle, what did a Terran dreadnought look like? The thought was terrifying enough to shatter the foundation of the Dominion's ideology. High above the galactic plane, the USC Hephaestus released its burden. The ball of cherubim ships drifted in the open void, safe from the nebula's radiation. Inside the human ship, Aris Thorn tapped a sequence into his console. Releasing magnetic binding in 3, 2, 1. Out in the void, the invisible grip vanished. The cherubim ships groaned as the pressure released. They drifted apart, battered, scraped, their paint ruined and their sensors blinded, but largely intact. They were alive. Fleet released, Alara said. They are powering up engines, low energy. They are limping away. No weapon locks detected. Good, Aris said, leaning back in his chair. That was annoying. We're behind schedule now. Aris, Alara said, her voice changing tone. Incoming transmission from the planet below the nebula, the Cherubim capital, Priority 1 channel. They are using the diplomatic protocol. Put it on. The face of High Archon Vralik appeared on the screen. He looked humbled, his mandibles lowered in a gesture of submission. Terran vessel Hephaestus, I am High Archon Vralik. We acknowledge your superiority. We withdraw our claim to the Velorum Drift. We ask only for mercy. We did not know. Aris blinked. Superiority? Mercy? Look, Archon, I think there's a misunderstanding here. We aren't conquering you. We don't want your sector. We're just here to fix the fence. The fence. Vralik asked, confusion marring his alien features. Aris sighed and tapped a few keys. Alara, show him the big picture. He deserves to know why we're so cranky about the nebula. Displaying deep-layer scans, Alara said. The screen in the Cherubim Council chamber shifted. It showed the nebula but stripped of its gas and dust layers by the Terran sensors. Revealed beneath the clouds was not a star nor a planet. It was a rift. A jagged tear in the skin of the universe, glowing with a sickening, chaotic light that defied the color spectrum. And pushing against that tear, trying to widen it, were shapes. Massive, writhing shadows that dwarfed star systems, entities from outside the universe trying to claw their way in. The nebula was not a natural formation. It was a patch, a cosmic bandage of gravity and ionized gas holding the rift shut, and the Hephaestus was there to tighten the stitches. You see that? Aris asked, pointing to the horrors on the screen. That's the abyssal void. It's been trying to leak into this galaxy for 1,000,000 years. The nebula keeps it suppressed, but the local gravity was getting weak and the seal was loosening. That's why we're here, to reinforce the gravity well, to keep the door locked. Vralik stared in absolute horror. He realized now why the Terrans had been so dismissive of the fleet. The Cherubim were fighting over lines on a map, while the Terrans were holding back the apocalypse. The Cherubim were children playing soldiers in the living room, unaware that there were wolves scratching at the front door, and the Terrans were the parents holding the door shut. You protect us, Vralik stammered. We protect the garden, Aris corrected gently. It's what we do. Humanity, we aren't conquerors, Archon. We grew out of that phase a long time ago. We realized the universe is fragile. It needs caretakers. It needs engineers. We travel the stars, finding the weak points, the CR. Axe the dangers, and we fix them. Sometimes that means moving a moon. Sometimes it means reigniting a dying sun. And sometimes it means stopping a noisy neighbor from blowing up the construction site. Aris leaned forward. We aren't your enemy, Vralik, but we are very, very busy. We need this sector stable. We need silence to work. Can we count on your cooperation, or do I need to call in the actual military? Because trust me, the compliance division is a lot less polite than the engineering corps. They don't use gravity nets. They use erasure. Vralik shuddered at the thought. If a construction ship could juggle an armada, a warship would simply delete their civilization from existence. You have our cooperation, Vralik said, bowing low. The Dominion stands ready to assist if we can. Just keep the traffic clear, Aris said, and maybe send some supplies. We're running low on coffee. Hephaestus out. The screen went black. Aris Thorn spun his chair around. Well, that went better than expected. Usually they try a second wave, Alara smiled. They were scared. You terrified them. I just showed them the scale of things, Aris said, looking out at the nebula. The distortion waves from his ship were already smoothing out the gases, knitting the gravity well tighter, sealing the rift back into the dark. People fear what they don't understand. But once they understand how small they are, they usually calm down. Back on the Cherubim homeworld, Vralik stood before the window of the ossuary, looking up at the sky. He had spent his life believing that power was measured in the number of ships you owned, the planets you conquered, the noise you made. He realized now how wrong he had been. True power was quiet. True power was a gray, ugly ship that could rewrite the laws of physics to save a galaxy that didn't even know it was in danger. He turned to his council. Cancel the expansion plans for the Western Arm, he ordered. Disband the subjugation fleets, reassign the resources to scientific research and civil engineering. High Archon? Kraz asked, confused. We are warriors. No, Vralik said, looking at the stars with new eyes. We are children, and it is time we learned how to help maintain the house before the wolves get in. We must learn from the Terrans. We must learn to be gardeners. 3 cycles later, a small cherubim transport, unarmed and painted in white, approached the Hephaestus. It carried no troops, no weapons. It carried crates of rare isotopic stabilizers that the Terrans had mentioned in passing were useful for their reactor mix, and confusingly for the cherubim logistics officers, several tons of the finest caffeinated stimulants the Dominion could synthesize. Eris Thorne watched the transport dock. Looks like we got neighbors, Alara. Friendly ones, she noted. Best kind, Eris said. He watched the nebula the rift was sealing. The red glare of the abyssal entities was fading, pushed back into the dark by the artificial gravity well. The galaxy was safe for another few thousand years. Nobody would know. Nobody would build statues for the crew of the Hephaestus, and that was fine. Eris picked up his mug. Let's get this patch finished. I hear there's a black hole in the Andromeda sector that's starting to wobble. We've got a long shift ahead of us. As the Hephaestus worked, weaving the fabric of space like a master loom, the cherubim fleet, now reorganized and humbled, formed a perimeter. Not to attack, but to guard. They set up beacons warning travelers away. They patrolled the silence. For the first time in their history, they were not predators. They were the dogs guarding the sheep, serving the shepherd who walked quietly among the stars, carrying not a sword but a wrench. And in the silence of the Velorum drift, a new understanding blossomed. The universe was not a battlefield to be won. It was a machine, vast and intricate, and the humans were the mechanics who kept the gears turning. The cherubim had feared the ship because it looked weak. Now they revered it because they knew the truth. The ship no one feared had destroyed an armada without firing a shot. But more importantly, it had destroyed an idea. The idea of war was replaced by the idea of duty. And as the Hephaestus finally finished its work and engaged its slipspace drive to vanish into the void toward its next job, the High Archon of the cherubim saluted the empty space where it had been. Travel safely, Gardener, he whispered. We will watch the gate until you return. The stars shone a little brighter that night, or perhaps it was just that the shadow of arrogance had finally been lifted from the eyes of the Dominion. In the deep dark, humanity continued its work, the silent custodians of a galaxy that slept soundly, unaware of the monsters under the bed or the tired engineers who kept them at bay. The narrative of the Hephaestus did not end in the Velorum drift, the data logs of the K. Cherubim were eventually shared with other races, the aquatic hydri, the silicon-based lithids, the energy-state beings of the core. The story spread along the trade routes and the subspace relays. It became a legend, a myth of the gray ghosts. Diplomacy changed across the quadrant. When a human vessel appeared, always solitary, always utilitarian, always strangely calm, fleets did not power up weapons. They powered down shields. They opened channels. They asked, how can we assist? Because the galaxy had learned the lesson of the cherubim. You do not fight the maintenance crew. You do not threaten the janitor of the cosmos. Because the janitor has keys to doors you don't even know exist, and if you make a mess, he has the power to simply wipe you off the floor. But there was a deeper layer to the human presence, one that Vralik began to uncover years later as he studied the data the Hephaestus had left behind. He found files encrypted in the header of the map data. Mathematical proofs, philosophical treatises. He sat in his private study, now an old cherubim, his shell fading to a dusty gray. He read a file titled The Burden of the Firstborn. We were not always the caretakers, the text read. Once we were like you. We burned, we conquered, we screamed at the sky, but we reached the edge of our cradle and looked out and we saw that the universe was dying. It is old. It is fraying. Entropy is a rot that eats the foundation of reality. We had a choice. We could continue to fight over the scraps of a dying house, or we could try to fix the foundation. We chose the work. It is lonely work. We gave up our golden ages, our empires, our gods, to become the tools the universe needs. We do not ask for gratitude. We ask only for silence so we can hear the gears grinding. If you are reading this, then you have taken the first step. You have looked past the gun and seen the hand that holds it. You are ready to join the crew. We are tired. There are so many cracks. There are so many leaks. We need apprentices. Look to the pulsar at coordinate X99. It is destabilizing. We have left tools there. Try to fix it. If you succeed, we will meet again. Vralik let the data slate drop to the desk. Tears, a biological reaction his species rarely expressed, welled in his eyes. It was not just a truce, it was an invitation. The humans were not just guarding the galaxy, they were waiting for someone to grow up enough to help them. Vralik activated his comms. Get me the Science Academy and the Fleet Admiral. We have a new mission, coordinate X99. We are going to fix a star. Fix a star, Archon? The voice on the other end asked, bewildered. With what fleet? With the engineering fleet, Vralik said, smiling for the first time in years. Paint the ships gray, remove the cannons, install gravity emitters. We have work to do. And so the Cherubim Ascendancy died and the Cherubim Stewardship was born. They joined the silent ranks of the gardeners, the species who had put down their swords to pick up shovels. They learned the secrets of gravity, the language of stars, the architecture of the void. And somewhere deep in the dark between galaxies where the fabric of reality was thin and the cold was absolute, the USC Hephaestus drifted. Eris Thorn, older now, gray hair matching his ship, looked at a new sensor reading. Another rift, another crack, another monster trying to get in. Ready, Alara? He asked. Ready, Eris, she replied. Let's get to work. The ship's engines flared, not with the roar of a conqueror, but with the steady, rhythmic hum of a machine that would run forever. The silent gardener moved on, unfeared, uncelebrated, and absolutely essential. And behind it the galaxy spun on, safe in the hands of those who knew that the greatest power was not the ability to destroy, but the ability to mend. The silence of the void was not empty. It was heavy with the labor of the just. And in that silence, humanity found its purpose, and the galaxy found its future. The end of the conflict was only the beginning of the understanding. As the Cherubim ships began their retrofit, converting missile bays into probe launchers and shield generators into harmonic dampeners, the cultural shift on the planet below was seismic. Statues of conquerors were not torn down, but plaques were added, recontextualizing them as the era of squabbling. New monuments were raised, abstract geometric shapes representing the fundamental forces of physics. The Academy of War was renamed the Institute of Universal Mechanics. It was a painful transition. Many of the warrior caste resisted. There were skirmishes, attempted coups by generals who could not accept a life without an enemy to kill. But Vralik held firm, bolstered by the terrifying knowledge of what lay beyond the nebula. He showed the dissenters the footage of the abyssal void. He showed them the scale of the threat. And one by one, the warriors lowered their weapons. They realized that our wars had been petty arguments in a burning house. The human philosophy, power is responsibility, became the central tenet of the new Cherubim society. They began to look at their neighbors not as potential subjects, but as potential colleagues. They opened their borders. They shared their technology. The Velorum Drift, once a contested borderland, became a hub of scientific cooperation. Decades passed. The Cherubim successfully stabilized the pulsar at X99. It cost them 3 ships and 1,000 lives lost to radiation and gravitational shear. But they did it. They saved the system. And when they finished, a signal came from the dark. It was a simple binary burst. Good job. Here is the schematic for the next tool. Coordinates follow. It was the humans. They were watching. They were approving. The Cherubim wept with pride. They had passed the test. They were no longer children. They were apprentices. The galaxy slowly changed. It was not a sudden utopia. There were still wars, still pirates, still greed. But there was a new undercurrent, a secret society of civilizations that had seen the gray ships. They formed a loose network, the Custodial Alliance. They did not interfere in local politics. They did not fight in trade wars. They focused on the big picture. They monitored black holes, reinforced dimensional barriers, and cleaned up the messes left by younger, dumber races. They became the immune system of the galaxy. And at the heart of it all, elusive and ancient, were the humans. They were rarely seen. They had moved on to the harder tasks, the ones that required millions of years of experience. They worked on the edges of the universe, where the expansion was accelerating, trying to tie the unraveling threads of reality back together. They had become a myth even to the Alliance, the first gardeners. But every now and then, when a catastrophe was inevitable, when a star was about to go supernova in a populated sector, or when a subspace experiment threatened to tear a hole in time, a gray ship would appear. It would be blocky, ugly, and silent. It would ignore hails. It would ignore threats. It would simply do the impossible, reverse time, condense space, delete energy, and then vanish. And the people of the galaxy would watch in awe, and parents would tell their children the story. Don't be afraid of the dark, they would say. The humans are out there, and they are fixing it. The story of the Hephaestus and the Armada became the foundational parable of this new age. It was taught in schools. It was preached in temples. The lesson was simple. True strength does not look like a sword. It looks like a shield. It does not roar, it hums. And it does not seek to rule, it seeks to serve. In the end, the Cherubim realized that the humans had conquered them after all. Not with fire, but with example. They had conquered their souls, and for that the Cherubim were eternally grateful. The universe was vast, cold, and hostile, but it was also a garden. And as long as there were gardeners willing to stand in the mud and do the work, life would find a way to bloom. The ship no one feared had not just destroyed an armada, it had saved a civilization from itself, and that was the greatest victory of all.